For the past 18 years, Dr. JeanHouston has been a leading pioneer in the field of mind and brain research and in the development of social change. She has taught and lectured at over 400 colleges and related institutions in the United States and abroad. Dr. Houston has been the featured speaker and an advisor to numerous scientific and governmental organizations, including the United Nations. In 1965, she founded the Foundation for Mind Research, where years of development have led to the application of her work to educational, mental, and physical health programs and other related areas. Dr. Houston is currently the president of the Association for Humanistic Psychology and is active in setting up programs in human potential training throughout the world.
Of being is something that's happening in our planet, whether we like it or not. We are perhaps in the most interesting time in human history. We would have to say that it's almost an entirely different planet. It's almost an entirely different way of how we deal with our humanness. For example, when I was a child, I used to go to the movies every Saturday, and I would sit all day through the 20 cartoons, and then I would sit through the Van Johnson picture and the June Allison picture, and come out at the end of the day and say, it's still Saturday. But there was one moment in those movies that was so important to me, and it was the moment in which the cartoon cat ran over the cliff, being chased by the mouse, and kept on running, and started to suddenly discovered that it was treading air over the abyss. Looked down and said, whoops, and then tread back. And I would say, oh, isn't that great? Isn't that wonderful? Because I knew that was very important. And I found out why. In a sense, that was a symbol of where we are in our time. We are treading air over the abyss. We are at a time at the end of one age, at the beginning of a new one. We're the people of a parenthesis. And there's no juicier time to be alive than the time of parenthesis, where one is really beginning to explore the new structures of our humanness, of what it means to be human, of what it means to live in a world like this. But it's a very different kind of world. It's a world which demands the use of mental and physical and emotional capacities which really in many ways have been on the shelf for 100,000 years. Until very recently, we have been, to use the Latin term, homo laborans, man and woman, the laborer. People who did just enough to use just enough potential to put food in their stomach and a roof over their head. And we developed just those potentials that enabled us to persist, to subsist. We did not develop the incredible range of potentials that we have because we didn't need to. And now we are in a world, we're in a global village, we're in a world in which we have so many challenges, so much complexity, that we have really literally got to grow or die. We have to begin to make use of all of these different capacities. Now, how do we do that? Because, as I often say, we are living in a planet in which we're using about, what would we say, 5% of our mental capacities, maybe 10% of our physical capacities. That's all. That's all, and that's already an exaggerated figure. Now, how do we begin to make use of these other potentials? We're being educated for about the year 1825. Not for the extraordinary demands and challenges of our time. At our foundation, the Foundation for Mind Research in New York, and some of the related institutions with which I'm connected, what we are doing is we're beginning to explore some of that untapped potential, that potential that was not necessary to the human being in his role as man and woman, the laborer. Man and woman who just did enough to subsist. And we explore many different kinds of capacities, physical capacities, for example. We use such a small percentage of our physical capacities. Now, this is very important because we find that how we move, how we use our bodies with respect to gravity, with respect to our muscle systems, also determines very intensely how we think, how we perceive, how we know our world. If you grow up this kind of things and you just sort of go around like a big hunk, you know, and just walking around as many people do, or if you're taught that great posture is chest out, belly in, eating that everything is closed off and you're shutting off the blood to the brain, getting very dumb, by the way, I might add, and you as you get older, you use less and less of the body. Do you know what you're doing? You are systematically cutting off a great deal of the brain, because as you, the technical term is, as you disinhibit the motor cortex, you also disinhibit thinking, sensing, feeling, knowing. So one of the things we find in our research is that people must begin to exercise, or they must begin to use different kinds of physical procedures. They might be the Oriental martial arts. They might be the Feldenkrais methods, which we developed. They might be systems of exercises in which we can very simply learn how to disinhibit. By using more of the body, we begin to disinhibit more of the mind.
It's difficult to learn.
No, they're not. You could look at our book, Listening to the Body. They're very simple. One of the most unnatural ways of learning in a school is to sit behind a desk for hours and hours. The child does not learn that way. What is happening is that his perception, his learning ability is becoming limited as he sits there behind that desk. A lot of children, for example, are naturally kinesthetic thinkers. That means they are thinkers who move. And many of these children we have falsely branded as hypermanic children. Now, there are hypermanic children, but there's also just noisy kids, too. There are kids who need to move. And so that we find, for example, that some children think much better if they're thinking in a dancing pattern or a rhythmic pattern. You know the story of how I was working in a school, a black school, in the New York area. I was teaching teachers how to work with what was bureaucratically referred to as minority group non-learners. I talked to these children and I discovered, good Lord, they knew more than I did. They were much smarter than me. And why were they being called stupid? They weren't stupid. They weren't learning what they were supposed to be learning, but they were by no means stupid. So I asked little Tommy, I said, Tommy, what is this? 5 plus 3 plus 2. He said, oh man, get lost, go away. I said, Tommy, what is this? He said, that's 10, man. I said, why didn't you tell me before? He said, you didn't ask me before. And he was right, because I was asking him in terms of Northern European expectations of intelligence. That is, I was asking in terms of expectations of the nature of intelligence from a very small part of the world, and using, by the way, a very small part of the brain, a small part of the left hemisphere. Now, we find that the way the brain works and the way neurological dominance goes, different children have different dominance. All of us have different dominance. My friend Sir John Eccles, who's the great Nobel Prize neurophysiologist, says, you know, we're really rather born with different bumps on the brain, in a sense. I mean, he's using a whimsical metaphor, but it's not that far. Some people think musically. Some people think in images. Some people think with their whole bodies. And so, for example, little Tommy came out of a culture in which, from the time he was a very tiny child, kids were thinking rhythmically. And if I had him thinking rhythmically, or in terms of movement, by the way, in the brain, the levels of order are sitting next to the levels of rhythm, so that he could put together logical problematics and orderly sequences if he was doing it rhythmically, because that is the way he was acculturated from the time he was a very tiny child. If we find that if a child does not learn well, let us say in a verbal linear manner, a Northern European manner, he may learn very well in what we call a sensory motor level. If he is dancing, if he is singing, if he is acting, if he is tasting and touching, what is he doing? Physiologically, he's actually using many more parts of the brain. So that if an idea doesn't come through in one way, it may come through in the other. I'll give you an example. Let us take a very simple one. The learning how to spell. Now, it can be done phonetically or phonymically with sounds or just with abstract symbols. Those abstract symbols don't mean very much to the child. But suppose the cat, C-A-T, is And close your eyes and see that cat running and see that chasing that mouse. Oh, you see it going around. And close your eyes and you see the cat. How do you see the cat? You do. Oh, good. What does the cat look like? Oh, he's great. What is yours? Mine's red. Mine's a red cat. Red cat. Red cat. Now, let's make those letters. You know, well, by golly, at the end of a 10-minute period, they will never forget that. And you'll say, well, then they have to go through all the other letters, like words for metaphor or, suspension the same way? No, not at all. Once those symbolic structures have been coded into a larger range of knowing, into feeling, into color, into taste, into dancing, then those symbolic structures are loaded. When we have studied, as we have, the early lives, the early childhood of people who are enormously facile and alert learners, and who are also high actualizers, who use their intelligence to creative ends in unusual ways, we have found the same phenomena, as for example in the case of Margaret Mead. These are, as children, they tend to be educated in such ways that all their senses are engaged. So they're not just thinking in one mode, a linear, verbal, analytic mode. They are touching, tasting, seeing, hearing what they're being educated for. Take Margaret Mead. She was born into a family of educators. They knew so much about education, they refused to send her to school. So most of her early years was not spent in school. She was educated at home. And what they do? Well, from the time she was a tiny baby, they exposed her to following some advice from Maria Montessori, who was just popped up at that time, and also William James. They began to expose her to colors, masterpieces of painting. They cranked up the old His Master's Voice Victrola, this is circa 1902, 1903, and she would be exposed to great works of music. Her sensory system was being developed. In other words, she had more hooks and eyes being developed upon which to catch a great deal of information. Now, also she was made from the time she was a small child to build little machines, to weave, to do fine muscle-to-eye coordination. That means that she learned how to do the beginning, the middle, and ends of things. Too many children in our world are unfortunately become slaves to the switch. Throw the switch, shoop, the world is set into motion. Throw the switch, everything is done. They know the beginning, they know the end, they don't know the middle. Why do you suppose so many people in our time want their instant gratifications? It's because they've never had to go through the sheer flow of processes. It's very important. In one of the schools that we've helped create, the Mead School in Byram, Connecticut, a very interesting school, because what we have done is many of the things that the young Margaret Mead did. It's not named for her, by the way, but it's just an interesting correspondence of names. These children have an arts-related curriculum, which means that they may spend 20 to 60% of their time in the arts. Now, not doing arts the way you and I did arts. When people say, let's go back to basics and get rid of the frills. In some sense, they're correct, because a lot of what is going by the arts deserves to be gotten rid of. Not making little macaronis with paper or spraying tin cans. No, no. These children learn how to make collages. They learn batiks. They learn weaving. They learn the beginning, middle, and ends of processes. If you were to see some of their artworks, you would say, this is the best work of a folk craft museum or a modern museum of art. And you'd find out that it was all being made by children between 3 and 11. Well, by developing these art things, they develop the internal symbolic structures to then go into the math class or into the history class and to pick up information very rapidly. For example, if a 6-year-old child is learning how to weave, he or she also is learning how to make a grid, something that normally would not come up for, 5 or 6 or 7 years. And thus, when they go into the mathematics class, they have all those basic symbolic structures they have the symbolic structures essentially working in more areas of their brain, and then these particular structures can then be incorporated into the learning procedure. Now, at this particular school, these children are running, 1 to 4 grade levels ahead of virtually every school in the country in every subject except spelling. And recently they've brought their spelling up too. So that gives you an idea of what happens if you have a strong art curriculum, an art curriculum in which is serious art, and you also have the learning of beginning, middle, and ends of processes. If children are dancing, touching, tasting, smelling, living information, they are using more areas of the brain. So if something comes by and it doesn't get them one way, it will pick up on another way. I have never seen a stupid child using these methods. I've seen incredibly stupid educational systems that systematically cut off the child, that I would say, in some sense, even cause brain damage. Fortunately, the brain is an immensely resilient instrument, so that you can't damage it too much, and you can bring it back. But our school systems, which could really be creating the possible human, which could be creating human beings who are adequate, who are able, who have the different ways of looking and being in the world to solve the incredible complexity of the problems, this could be happening in schools. It is not. And we can't get away with that anymore. We cannot continue to educate children for the year 1825 or 1850. And the irony is that here we are in the beginning of the golden age of mind and brain research. The golden age, where never before have we really understood how great is the human potential. And it's really only in the schools that it can happen. And with incredible problems that threaten to overwhelm us, who wins first? Do the school system win, or does the breakdown of everything that's happening in our society wins? I'm betting on the school systems, because I think that there's a kind of strange X factor in history that enters in and saves the day. Something else also, here we're speaking in California. Now, California, as some other states, but more so, has an enormous drug problem. You and I were talking about it before, especially with high school students who've tested out all kinds of drugs, and their reality looks different. Their reality looks very different, and they're not about to go and buy the reality that they're being taught in the schools. But if they were taught a deeper reality, if they were taught real physics and metaphysics, if they had extended perceptions in which to grasp the complexity of an idea, if they were taught Gregory Bateson, you see, I was talking about, and to see the way everything is in pattern, to see the contexts that go through nature, to see the basic whirl in galaxies and also in the RNA nucleus. The very stuff of reality is so fascinating if they were really taught these things, and if they were given the tools, the intellectual, the psychological, and spiritual tools in the schools to do these things. I assure you they would get off the drugs so fast, because the reality is far more interesting than the drugs. But people say, no, they've got to have staged sequential learning. Baloney. There's no such thing as staged sequential learning. What happens is often tremendous leaps and then stasis, and then tremendous leaps and stasis. But if our schools had very enriched environments, they could be providing for these things. One of the reasons I think that so many young people turn to drugs is they want a great leap forward. I don't think they get it out of the drug. They get the illusion of it, because they want the leaps of being that they feel their minds are desperately wanting to move into more and more areas of information, of knowing, of knowledge, of wisdom, and the schools are not providing. So they hope to get it out of the bottle, which of course they don't. But with what we know now, and with what we're learning about the nature of reality, I think it's possible. We are, with regard to reality, about where, I'd say about, the image I like is, consider a praying mantid, a bug addressing the United Nations. And the bug gets up in front of the United Nations and he says, not much food out there. Having no idea of the machinations of nations, the history of civilization. Just sees it as non-food. And we're with regard to that, with regard to reality. We look out there and we say, so that's all there is. But now we're bursting through. We're growing up. Evolution is entering into time. We are becoming conscious of what we are. It's one of the greatest times of evolution through man becoming conscious of itself. And people are desperate to find something, some kind of instrument that takes them into this larger ecology. There's nothing spooky or supernatural about it. It's just the way things are. And that's why they go to the drugs. But the fact is that the basic instrument is right there. We are so over-endowed, it's almost obscene. with somewhere between, we're not even sure, it might be 20 to 100 billion brain cells, with internuncial cells interconnecting at the speed of light, with millions of proprioceptors, ways of knowing. We use such a small fraction. But if we become what we are, then quite literally, I would even suggest to you the metaphor that if some of the things I'm suggesting happen, it might be that our great-great-great-grandchildren would look back on us as Neanderthals. That is how great the leap would be in cultural evolution. We've talked about a few kinds of ways of knowing. Using the body to think, you know, keeping that body going. People should not age in the way that they do. It should not be a kind of downhill things. One of the reasons is the body is not being used. In my great friend Gay Luce's program up in Berkeley, the SAGE program, there we see elderly people laughing, interacting, using their bodies, using their minds, symptom-free, learning. An old lady once said to me up there, she said, "I am learning more at 75 than I did at 5. And by golly, she should. Because she has that tremendous breadth and range of wisdom and knowing, so that she is deepening into, but by getting up from the television set at the old people's home, and by beginning to move that body and the mind waking up and doing meditation and learning to control symptoms and getting new interest in life, these people wake up. The golden years should be that. But that SAGE program is so very important. And then to take these elderly people who are learning all these ancient techniques of realization and have them go into the high schools and teach the children, so that you restore the great chain of being between the generations. There's so much different styles of thinking, of knowing. Well, one is thinking in images. Many children are natural imagizers. They may not be very bright in verbal linear, but they may close their eyes and problems and understandings will unfold. When we study the phenomenology of high-level creativity, we discover that many of these highly creative people are thinking pictorially. They literally close their eyes and see pictures. Why? Because a great more can be condensed into the dynamics of the symbolic image than can be had in verbal linear thought. If I'm trying to think of something in my usual verbal linear way, which I'm a verbal linear thinker, as you may have noticed, I think this. I think A, B, C, D, E. I think 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But if I'm a visual thinker, oh, it's so different. I'm thinking A through L, L through Z, 1 through 5, 5 through 10. I'm thinking literally in whole constellations of information. Also, imagistic thinking comes from the right hemisphere of the brain. Now, the right hemisphere of the brain has to do with spatial metaphors. It has to do with, it's not timed. The left hemisphere is timed. This is more infinity. Thus, more, and the brain can process millions of images in microseconds. Thus, by thinking in images, more can be thought in a few seconds than can ever be thought of in verbal linear thinking. And speaking about visual thinking, and that so many children are naturally visual thinkers, it can be really a great tragedy when they are educated just in one mode. A child may be very bright as a visual thinker and not be initially very bright as a verbal linear thinker. And thus often a child who thinks in this mode is made to feel inferior to the child who responds readily in a verbal linear mode. Now, this is very important because we may be losing some of our best and most creative thinkers, as well as people in general, to being lost to their natural intelligence. Let me give you a case in point. It's a very interesting story, but in some ways it's symbolic. It's a story that talks about a lot of people in this country. About 10 years ago, a woman kept calling me up, insisting that I come out to northern Michigan and speak to a women's club for no money, but just to come out, and she said it was very important that I come. And she called, and she called, and she called, so I said, well, okay, I'm coming. And I had to give up for a day teaching college, and so I went there and I gave the talk, and afterwards I went she asked me back to her home for tea and cake, and I went there. And I moved to sit down in the living room. She said, no, not there. Come downstairs. And she took me into the cellar, which I thought was very odd. And the cellar was filled with the most interesting machines you ever saw in your life. At least they seemed to be machines. It was as if Rube Goldberg was alive and well and living in northern Michigan. Funny machines, and this would turn around, the water would go through and thing, boom, and something would sound off, and a little pig would spin, and somebody would go on a record would turn on, and it was a wild and wonderful thing. And I looked around, and I played with these things, and I said, who made these? And this little boy, 12 years old, and Billy, he said, me? He looked away. And I turned to his mother and I said, well, you must be so pleased having such a bright kid. And she said, well, I'm pleased and I'm glad you are, but the teachers are not. He is flunking out of school. I'm flunking out of school. How is that possible? She said, well, I'm glad you asked that, Dr. Houston. Now, you thought that I invited you here to speak to the women's club. I said, no, madam, I'm beginning to suspect that you did not. She said, well, you're right. I've been studying Billy and children like Billy, and I think there's something very important here. Now, Billy is an enormously intelligent person, but he is flunking out of school, and he has a terrible self-image, and I think that if we could just sort of find out how to get Billy's mind stimulated in school, we can save a lot of children. I said, well, you've obviously got some ideas, show me. She said, all right, I will. Now, and she handed Billy a tape measure. She said, Billy, you know how you learn how to tell the measurements in a room? And he said, Mama, do I have to? He said, yes, go ahead, do it. So he took all these measurements, and he worked, and he worked, and he got it all wrong. The room turned out to be about the size of a football field. Then she said, Billy, do it your way. He said, oh, okay. And I saw his eyes closed, and I saw him work and figure things out. Sing little songs and put things down. Put things down, and he came out with the right answer. I said, what were you doing? Were you thinking in pictures? He says, yeah, but something else too. I said, what? He said, well, when I close my eyes, it's like a cross between music and architecture. That does it. I said, okay. And I called up the nun in the college that I was teaching, and I said, Sister Margaret Mary, I have something very important here. Will you please take care of my existentialist courses? And she said, oh, yes, Dr. Houston. It was wonderful teaching in girls' Catholic colleges in the 1960s because the nuns were ready for anything. Anyway, so I stayed on, and I started to test Billy, and there was no question. He could not think in verbal linear modes, but he was absolutely brilliant in visual and musical modes. So I took him to the university, where I had some friends at the testing department, and he had an IQ. Very bad, 85. I said, all right, Billy, I want you to take another IQ, but I want you to do it your own way. He said, well, that's not possible. I said, why? He said, because the questions have to be asked differently. I said, all right, I'll ask these questions visually, okay? And he said, yeah. And he taught me how to ask the questions. So he changed the whole IQ test. Well, I asked him the same questions, but in visual modes, and the boy's IQ was upwards of 135. Well, armed with truth, with scripture, the IQ, also with several wagons filled with his inventions, I walked into his classrooms the next day and I said, look at this. And the teachers had no idea he did these things, and they were so astonished. And I said, and look at this. IQ. They said, IQ? It must be true. I said, that's right, it's true. So people really believe those things. They said, well, what is it? And I said, he's a visual thinker. Let me show you. And I presented problems and tests that he had failed. And we presented them visually, and he could do beautifully. Well, I stayed around for the whole week teaching the teachers and working with the teachers in ways of working with visual children, how to present the problems. And once they had a sense of themselves as learners, how to begin to bridge visual thinking to verbal linear thinking. Because one of the things we discover is that you do not work on the weaknesses. What you do is you build up the strength, what is the neurological dominance. Once you build up the strength, then it is not difficult to bridge into the weakness. So that gradually, with somebody like Billy, for example, we bridged from a thinking in pictures to letting those pictures begin to form words. And then before you know it, we were probably literally doing real neurological work in the brain. Now, within a year, when his mother wrote to me, actually I followed, but actually it was close to that, but let's say after 1 year, he was no longer flunking out. He had a B average, and he had just come out of his own shell. He is now, 22, 23 years old, and he is a design engineer with several of his own patents. Now, he could have just gone down the drain. He did not, because he was caught in time. But it's also interesting that he never went above a B average. And I said, why? He said, well, you know, they give me these multiple choice questions, A, B, C, D, and I generally add E, because I find a much more interesting way of answering the problem. So the teachers, you know, silently would check him off. Billy's name is Legion. There are many Billies. There are some children who are musical thinkers. If the young Mozart had gone to school in modern schools, he would have failed miserably because he thought in musical images. Now Mozart, who died in his 30s, wrote so much music that it would take most people just 25, 30 years just to copy it out. Because he would say, when I sit down at the piano and I compose what I hear. That's all I'm doing. I'm merely setting it down. And whence it cometh from, I know not. But I thank the good Lord, it is at least Mozartish. Just as my nose, my aquiline nose, is a Mozart nose, so the music is in a Mozart vein. There have been so many thousands of cases like that. And this is something that's very interesting. See, imagery is not just a visual form. It can be auditory. For example, I am an auditory thinker. If I listen, I'm hearing music in some sense all the time. And it's music that is just going on. It's part of what we call the self-creating works of art. Many of the great works of art are self-creating. Enid Blyton, the great children's story writer, wrote 400 children's books. She said, when I write, I get my little typewriter, I put it on my knees, I put in a fresh sheet of paper, and I watch the paper. And then my characters appear, and they play it out, and I listen to them, and I type away what's happening. And sometimes a character makes a joke, a jolly good one, and I laugh, and I say, well, I couldn't have thought of that joke in 100 years, and I wonder who thought of it. Now, who thought of it was the rest of consciousness. That's who thought of it. We are, with regard to our consciousness, rather like people who inhabit an attic with the first, second, third, fourth floors uninhabited, and the basement forgotten about altogether. And a lot of creativity is merely the unconscious organization of life in pattern and stories that is probably in some sense going on all the time, but which we do not consciously become aware of. True, if you train your talent, if you get yourself to be a fine musician, then in a sense music is going on, then that patterning, you have the instrument through which this can then come through, but it's been unconscious. But very conscious people, very conscious creative people, are people who frankly have put the light of consciousness into other floors so that they can retrieve this much, much more readily. But to be human is to be in a constant creative process. What are dreams about? Well, these are going on all the time, especially if we have a talent which is priming our unconscious. And so we find that a great many of the great works of art happen to be sort of self-creative by the other levels of the psyche. That's something else. Part of the studies of imagery show us that there is so much vastness of ourselves of which we are unaware. We are living merely at the surface of our being, but we cannot afford to do that anymore. So it's not a question of becoming aware of unconscious. It's making what had been unconscious, the other side of the moon, conscious, to bring that full spectrum of our human capacities, or as much as we can, into demonstrable, working, living in existential space and time. The most realized human being that I ever met, I would have to say that many psychologists would call primitive. Because he responded so totally. He looked at the world as if it was thou, as if it was personal, in all parts personal, in all parts sentient. Let me tell you about it. I was 13 years old. I was this great big overgrown girl. I was, my present size by the time I was 11. And I used to go running down Park Avenue, New York City, late for high school. And I ran down the street one day, and I ran into an old man, and I knocked the wind out of him. And he was laughing, and I picked him up, and he said to me, in a French-English accent actually, he said, "Are you planning to run like that for the rest of your life?" I said, "Yes, sir, it looks that way." He said, "What? Bon voyage." And I said, "Bon voyage," and I ran to school. About a week later, I was walking my fox terrier, Champ, and there was the old man, the same place that I had seen him, 83rd Street and Park Avenue. He said, "Ah, my friend the runner, and you have a fox terrier? I knew one many years ago in France. Where are you going?" I said, "Well, sir, I'm taking Champ to Central Park." He said, "I will go with you, all right?" I said, "Sure." He said, "I will take my Constitutional." I said, "Good." His name was something like Mr. Thayer or Mr. Tayer. And I used to alternate between calling him Thayer and Tayer because it was too close. So old Mr. Tayer and I started taking these walks once or twice a week for about a year to Central Park or various places, but mostly it was the park. And he was something. He was man in his 70s at the time. He had the most beautiful face I have ever seen, and it was a face that had grown beautiful with age. Long, elegant French Gothic face. Light up with comedy and fall into his pensiveness. Wonderful. He would suddenly, he had no self-consciousness at all. He would suddenly fall to his knees on the ground and see a caterpillar. He said, "Jean, a caterpillar." What is a caterpillar becoming? Changing, moving, transforming, metamorphosis. He loved the word metamorphosis. He said, "Hey, Jean, feel yourself a caterpillar and find out what you are when you become butterfly. Hey, Jean, look at the clouds. God's calligraphy in the sky." And then he would name all the clouds. Well, after you've heard the clouds were God's calligraphy, by golly, you learn the names of the clouds. Hey, Jean, sniff the wind. Same wind sniffed by Jesus Christ, huh? Same wind sniffed by Alexander, by Jeanne d'Arc. Sniff the wind of history, sniff the wind sniffed by Joan of Arc. And he knew a great deal about bones and old stones. And he would go up to a rock and say, he would address it personally. "Ah, my friend, the mica schist layer, huh? Do you remember the time, you know?" And he would get involved with everything. All of life became a kind of interdependent spectrum in which everything was related to everything else. Everything was related to everything else. There was a pattern of life that connected. He would look at spirals we'd find little snails. Then he would say how that spiral was repeated in the galaxies and was repeated in the structures of cells. And everything became part of everything else. It became God's calligraphy. You know. People began to follow us around. Not laughing at us, but with us, you know. It was laughter and ebullience and just an incredible, it was as if we all had leaky margins and we were all flowing into a kind of universal stuff. And I would go home and I would say to my mother, "Mother, I met my old man again. And when I am with him, I leave my littleness behind. Because you could not be small around Mr. Teilhard. You grew, your soul was quickened. And he looked at you as if you were God in hiding. And something deep in you quickened and came to life." Well, after a while, after about a year, I never saw him again. I'd wait and wait. Turned out he died. I didn't know that. He never came. And the dog would go, those were my sentiments, you know. And then, some years later, somebody, when I'd finished college, handed me a book called The Phenomenon of Man. And golly, I read, it didn't have a cover, and I read the book, and it was, some of those sentiments were so familiar that I said, this is from my past. Let me see, does the cover of the book, you have the cover? They said, yes. I said, does it have a picture of the author? They said, yes, let me see. And I looked at it. There was this great picture of the author on the back. And of course, it was my old man. Mr. Teilhard had been Teilhard de Chardin, the great French scientist, paleontologist, priest, philosopher, the man who has provided a cosmology and understanding of the nature of things for so many, one of the great minds of the 20th century. And of course, that is who I'd been meeting outside the Jesuit rectory of St. Ignatius every week for that year, that great luminous year. The man who looked at you as if you were God in hiding, the man who saw the pattern that connected, one of the most realized and childlike and ebullient and loving and fun-filled human beings. The most actualized man, the most actualized being I'd ever met.